Consider the crime waves of 1890 to 1930, when millions of poor European immigrants came to America only to be trapped in inner-city slums, suffering the effects of severe economic inequality and social marginalization. Around the turn of the century, the Harvard economist William Ripley described the national scene. The horde now descending upon our shores is densely ignorant, yet dull and superstitious withal, lawless with a disposition to criminality, unquote. Very interesting. But the solution, Ripley argued, was not stigma, isolation, and the promotion of fear. Quote, they are fellow passengers on our ship of state, unquote, he wrote. Quote, and the health of the nation depends upon the preservation of the vitality of the lower classes, unquote. Now, why does the preservation of the vitality of the lower classes, why is it that these people are so critical to the health and the future of the nation, using Ripley's language, as opposed to that of its black lower classes that had labored in the country for free since the early part of the 17th century, and in some cases actually the latter part of the 16th century? How is it that those people are not seen in the same light? As a spokesman for saving white immigrant communities from the violence within, Ripley was part of a national progressive movement led by Jane Addams, the influential social worker of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the face of grisly gang-related youth shootings duplicated almost every morning, Addams wrote, she insisted that everyone from the elite to community organizers to police officers had a part to play. She and other progressives mobilized institutional resources to save killers and the future victims of killers. Violent white neighborhoods were flooded with social workers, police reformers, and labor activists committed to creating better jobs and building a social welfare net. White-on-white violence fell slowly but steadily in proportion to economic development and crime prevention. In almost every way, the opposite situation applied to Black Americans. Instead of provoking a steady dose of compassionate progressivism, crime and violence in Black communities fueled the racist belief that, as numerous contemporaries stated, Blacks were their, quote, own worst enemies, unquote. An early version of the violence card. Black people were, quote, criminalized, unquote, through various institutions and practices, whether Southern chain gangs, prison farms, convict lease camps, and lynching bees, or Northern anti-Black neighborhood violence, and race riots. Racial criminalization has continued to this day, stigmatizing Black people as dangerous, legitimizing or excusing white-on-Black violence, conflating crime and poverty with Blackness, and perpetuating punitive notions of justice. Vigilante violence, stop-and-frisk racial profiling, and mass incarceration as the only legitimate responses. But the past does not have to be the future. The violence card is a cynical ploy that will only contribute to more fear, more Black alienation, and more violence. Rejecting its skewed logic and embracing a compassionate, progressive solution for Black crime is our best hope for saving lives and ensuring that young men like Trayvon Martin do not die in vain. Now, there's a caveat that has to be mentioned here in whether or not this gesture is made toward, again, this particular demographic. And this goes back to the point made in Sidney M. Wilhelm's book, Who Needs the Negro? Actually, Samuel Yet, another writer who wrote a book, The Choice, also makes this point. And then also in some of Wilhelm's later writings in the mid-'80s, he wrote about the economic demise of Black Americans and how this, in his estimation, was a prelude to genocide in his mind, which, again, he mentions in his earlier book. There were 2 points he had made in the Who Needs the Negro book that really plays into whether or not there's a decision made that this particular demographic is going to be helped. And it basically speaks to the origins of this particular population in the Western world and in the United States, in the American colonies, the British colonies, I should say, and also in the Caribbean. And it was whether or not, in the American case, were these people necessary? Were they still necessary in being able to achieve the aims that were part of the creation of America in the first place? So in his estimation, and this was looking at the situation that he saw in the late 60s. This is before the drug war and before the phenomenon of mass incarceration. So what he was able to see, and this was him looking at the economic data, unemployment figures at the time, income, education opportunities, job opportunities, wealth creation, all of those things. In his estimation, there were two things the two conclusions he arrived at. He said that the future of the Black American had more in common with Native Americans than it did with European immigrants. He said that both populations suffer from sort of two realities. Number one, they were economically unnecessary, meaning that the reasons why these populations were, well, number one, in the case of the Africans, why they were brought over to begin with, they no longer applied, right? They were no longer the primary means of labor. So what are you going to do with them? Because the second conclusion applied in their case, and it certainly applied for Native Americans, they were socially undesirable. Economic obsolescence and social undesirability, it are the two factors that are going to define or determine whether or not there is any help or the extent to which help is extended to these groups of people. So if you don't need them anymore and you don't want them, then why should you do anything for them? Especially if their numbers, the proportion or the size of the population within the country as it is constituted, if their numbers and whatever it is that they may or may not, whether or not they have anything that, you want or need, that'll determine the extent to which you extend a hand to them. So going back to Heinberg's point, that now these are populations that are seen as being parasites and or disease organisms. And then what do you do to parasites and disease organisms? Well, as the body is constituted, you are going to marshal the forces of the immune system, law and punishment, through law enforcement agencies, through legislation, through, policy, whatever it is. You're going to the extent that you're able to, you're going to do whatever is necessary in order to either control or eliminate the pest or the disease.